think we're live, aren't we?
Um, we are. I'm just going to get queued up so I can collect the comments. Make sure I can get at any comments that are coming in.
Well, that's awesome. While you're doing that, we'll just welcome the folks who are joining us right now. Welcome to Living in the Scriptures Live. We're going to be looking at Matthew 5:38 to around 4. Wow. Can't even remember the passage.
38 to 42.
It's like Jesus said, an eye for an eye, but I tell you, don't resist an evil person. And I don't know if I have that many comments or thoughts around this. I know a lot of people just kind of came and just said, man, that is such a shock passage. And maybe just opening it up and wide open for you guys. Like, what did I ended our kind of time in the passage, and we're going to be looking at it again this week. But this week, just wanted people to just, I guess, marinate in just how countercultural and counterintuitive that this is. And maybe you can share, like, what is your experience in, what Jesus has said, love, not just love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but love your enemies and pray for them. Do you have any stories? Do you guys have any, what's your initial comments?
I mean, something that has been it's been sticking out to me about this particular message is how throughout the scriptures, at the very beginning, when mankind falls into the grip of sin and through the fall, at the very early stages, you see Lamech, this man who is seventh generation from Adam and Eve. And I was reading it in Genesis for my devotional this week, and Lamech says to his wives, he says, "Hey, I have wounded a young man for striking me. I have killed a young man for attacking me. I will pay back 77 times, or 70 times 7 will be my revenge. Whatever people do to me, I'm going to do twice or 70 times more back." And to contrast that sort of attitude with the one of Jesus, where it's like, and even that middle step, like Jesus says, you have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And so the law comes in to limit the scope of our revenge. When someone wrongs us, we're only permitted to wrong them as much as they've wronged us. And Jesus says, well, actually, I'm going to tell you that the heart of God is to actually bless the people who are showing evil to you. And that's so out of this world. And when I think about personal stories, I mean, I can think of ways in which God has blessed me and shown kindness to me when I absolutely did not deserve it. I think that's the first thing that comes to mind, is that he continues to show me love. He continues to show me reception and blessing, even though I haven't treated him that way, especially in my earlier years, you could say. Brian, how about you?
Yeah, it's definitely a very radical passage that goes against what much of the world would consider to be normal, or to be fair, or to be just. But just from my personal experience, I would say it's a very freeing truth. When I feel like I need to get even, that I need to get revenge, I have to get back whatever I lost when somebody has verbally or otherwise taken something from me. That's a heavy weight to carry. And to be free from the obligation to punish others for what they've done to me, and being free to be able to love and bless, there's something very freeing in that. So I I still struggle with that sometimes, but I find there's a lot of freedom in practicing what Jesus here teaches.
Right.
Yeah, I think I agree with you guys. For me, I think one of the things that I remember is how I came to Christ, and family took me in and took me to their side. And I can't help but think of how many times I have offended them. And not in little ways, but in big ways. Like I think you know, I remember a camping trip that we went to, and I pulled a prank that was really completely inappropriate in all sorts of ways. And they forgave me. Not only did they forgive me, they continued to love me through it. And I just can't help but think, man, that did something to change my heart. We talk about, Caleb, you talk about like limiting revenge, right? Like, I think sometimes the broken part of us, not even just the broken part of it, it's just us, wants to kind of escalate, and the best of us, well, we just kind of keep, maintain status quo, almost what Jesus said, if you love those who love you, what reward or what have we gained in it? But for this family that took me in, it really changed the way I thought, and really made me think twice about who Christ was, because of the way they treated me. When, man, like I said, I did things to them that, I still shake my head at, and just thank the Lord that these folks had been touched by Christ.
Yeah, I think too, looking back at world history, and there have been a few key leaders who have put this principle into practice in their leadership. I think of Gandhi in India, Martin Luther King Jr. In the United States, who really were gripped by Jesus' teaching these very verses and believed in nonviolent means of expressing themselves and showing love to their enemies. And it was very effective.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because this week I'm going to talk a little bit about Martin Luther King Jr. And much of it is, like you said, how much that changed things. One of the things that makes me feel nervous is a lot of the things that are going on. I feel like most of the rhetoric that kind of goes on is really much more like tit for tat, and there isn't a deep, if anything, there isn't a compassion or a de-escalation in hurt and pain. Rather, it seems to be escalating some of it. And what Martin Luther King Jr. was able to do was de-escalate those things by the fact that he wasn't going to play the tit for tat game. Well, I think what you've said, Brian, is so true. Like in history, what tends to happen is the oppressed tend to rise up to then become the oppressor without this, right? That's just the trend, right? You can see it in the different, if you just read through history and how often groups or people kind of rise up, and when they get into power, they're just as oppressive as the folks that they replaced. And I think that's where, when do we stop that, right? I think laws and justice, we need them, but in and of themselves, they're really just setting limits. They're setting boundaries for how far evil and how far brokenness can go. But Jesus kind of puts it further and says, I want you to take back territory. I want you to kind of overcome evil with good, not just kind of escalate it.
Yeah, it was a really great message on Sunday, Peter, on this. And I was particularly challenged by the fact that you point out that so far in the Beatitudes, it's kind of this, whoever does this or whoever does that. And here Jesus says, no, it's you. You go the extra mile. You turn the other cheek. When you are the one who are wronged and you are taken advantage of, you are the one who needs to respond in with a kingdom attitude. And for Jesus, the followers of Jesus, I mean, we all have to face the fact that that this is exactly what God has done to us. If he repaid us for what we did, I mean, then he would be, we would be toast. If he repaid us according to our deeds, we would be completely undone. And that's just if he's being fair. That's not even if he's like out for revenge. That's even worse then. But that's not how he's treated us. He said, I'm coming into the world and I'm coming to redeem it and save it. And so I'm in it for the long haul, which means I'm going to show you what love looks like. And he lays down his life for us. So we really, we have to square up with the fact that this is how God has treated us. And so it's maybe comforting to know that God hasn't asked of us anything he hasn't been willing to do himself. And we can actually grow to be like God in this, and we can see the world change, and we can see at least lives change and see us change as we walk in God's ways. We can become more like him and enjoy that experience.
Absolutely. And I think, this coming week, and maybe there's a little bit of a preview of it, is like, how do we take steps towards this? Because like you said, this is like completely outside of our own thinking. Because like I said in the sermon, like, my natural tendency is like, if somebody offends me, I want to kung fu them or something. In Leviticus 19:18, which was what, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law used, it reads, "Do not seek revenge or bear grudges against one of your people, but love your neighbor as yourself, for I am the Lord." And we kind of threw out that question, like, who is your neighbor? And I love what you said about it, Caleb. You said, that question almost extends to like, who do you see as like a threat in your life and who's not? Or do you see it as an opportunity? And it comes from, I think it comes from Jesus. Like, Jesus didn't see our rebellion and our wickedness or running away from him while we were sinners as a threat to him. Engage, rapid opportunity to bring his love to us. Yeah. And so I know, Caleb, you've asked that question of us. So maybe I'm just going to throw it out. It's like, how would you answer that question? Like, who are the people? Who's my neighbor and who's not my neighbor?
Well, it can be easy to, particularly in this age, we've talked about it before, it can be easy to, in a world of change where certain elements of perhaps government or even corporate power players in the world are able to make decisions that have nothing to do with maybe my personal will or my personal democratic right. It can be easy to fear and see people and see maybe the people who are acting in those roles, to see them as a threat, like whether it be with the notion of the Great Reset, or whether it be, climate activists that want to shut all of our livelihoods down and for their pie in the sky sort of view of what the world could be. What are they willing to sacrifice to create their heaven on earth, and what will that cost us? There's all sorts of opportunities there to see people as a threat, and it is liberating, as Brian said, to recognize that there are no threats. There are no threats in terms of nobody can harm me in a permanent way when I belong to God. I'm secure in him. I'm secure in his love, and I'm secure in his will. Nothing can befall me except for what he sees and he knows about, and he has promised me, heaven. He's promised me a place with him. He's promised me newness of life, and that, I actually have a short life here. It's not going to be a long one, but I have an opportunity to live it for him. And that means I can't afford to see people as a threat. Maybe you can see ideas as a threat and you want to engage that way. But people, Jesus came and he showed that God is bigger, you know. He showed that God is bigger and God's love is bigger, so that he, you know, as the nails are being driven into his hands, he can take that and not, instead of taking offense and curse the people who are taking his life, they're literally taking his life away. You know, if at that point Jesus can say, you know, Father, forgive them, if he can go, you know, dive deep into the depths of the Father's heart and seek love and forgiveness and seek peace for them, then, I mean, we ought to be able as his followers to do the same under any circumstances. And I admit this is not a possible thing if we're trying to do it on our own. If we're not calling out for the Holy Spirit, if we're not calling out for God's own heart, and if we're not going to God and pouring our heart out to him, telling him the things we are afraid of, telling him the ways that we do feel threatened. If we do that first, then God can take that and we can trade out our fear and trade out the ways we feel threatened. We can trade that out for his supply of love, you know, from the riches of his grace and for the riches of his mercy. And that's been for me, like I sometimes do get worried about the future, or worried about what people may do or not do. And the fact is that whatever comes, God's got enough for me to love those people. I believe that.
Yeah, I would say that whole question of who's my neighbor or who is a threat to me, Jesus answered that really in his parable of the Good Samaritan. And basically he said, you know, the person that the world would consider your greatest enemy, that's your neighbor too. So there's nobody that isn't your neighbor, really. Yeah. Anybody that can be or is a threat to you is still your neighbor, and you're still supposed to act neighborly, lovingly towards them. So that's a huge challenge. Now, I would, you know, I think of, just to take that story of the Good Samaritan, for example, if I saw somebody getting beat up on the road and I came at that moment, I think I would come in and help defend this fellow from getting beat up. Like, I don't think turning the other cheek means we don't.
You're not going to go, hey, save some for me. I need a beating too.
Yeah. I wouldn't go tell the guy that's getting beat up to go turn the other cheek now so he can get beat up some more. Like the Bible does say, where I wrote it down, Psalm 82 verse 3, defend the cause of the weak and the fatherless. Like, we are supposed to fight, so to speak, for justice and for human rights and all kinds of things. But if it comes to me, myself, and I'm being attacked, insulted or whatever, then turn the other cheek. But yeah, I don't know how you see that, the whole...
We can talk about that because Janice mentioned here, she said, you know, it's one thing not to seek revenge. It's another to turn the other cheek. And eventually I just want to stop the meanness. Enough is enough. And it puts into question, you know, where do you draw the line in instances of abuse? And maybe you had seen that comment, Brian, and wanted
No, I didn't.
Okay, but it's a perfect segue into that topic.
Yeah, because people are in situations where there is real abuse, and where I do not think that you should apply this passage to say you have to stay in that situation.
Absolutely not. And I think, you know, right from the beginning, we talked a little bit about the fact that, well, one is like, you know, Jesus is talking to his followers. And this is not like, you know, everyone or the court systems or the law systems and things like that. So, you know, we are definitely supposed to uphold the widow and the orphans and those who are oppressed and uphold justice. This doesn't refer to, you know, when you see your brother being beaten. You know, this is actually, you know, for you. And yet there's also in every one of these situations, I think, you know, there is an end, I guess, like, for lack of a better way of putting it. You know, you turn the other cheek and you walk away. And there is a level of, like, you know, in situations of abuse and ongoing no, there is a time when we need to remove people from that harm, uh, and absolutely,
Yeah,
that's
I would agree. And when it comes to the issue of abuse too, there's always um, I like to bring up the fact that if I think there might be situations where if you're turning the other cheek when you have an option to do otherwise, you're actually like enabling uh, you're enabling sin, in the abuser. You're enabling them to violate God, and God doesn't want us to enable wicked behavior. I think if um, there's that element too, where it's like you actually have an obligation to God to remove yourself so that the person can't continue their pattern of sin. Um, and so there is, I mean, yeah, there's wisdom at play here, but I do believe that Brian is right when he says, when it comes to you personally, and when it comes to situations, I mean, if a Roman soldier says, "Hey, by law, I'm exercising my Roman right to make you carry this heavy pack in the blazing sun for a mile because I'm done with it. So you get to carry it for a mile." Yeah, that may be a rule that kind of creates an exploitative situation. And if it's you, Jesus is saying, "Hey, well, what kind of a statement does it make if you're going to offer to carry it that second mile?" And I think when it comes to us, there's a choice to be made. Can we make a statement for Christ, and can we flex the bigness of our love at our own personal expense? Can we put God on display?
and that's part of it, right? Like, I think this is what Paul talks about. Our fight is not against flesh and blood, but against powers and principalities. A lot of this, I think, kind of goes back to what Jesus did, right? Like, overcome evil with good. And this is a little bit for the coming week. When we do that, kind of the goal isn't to defeat or humiliate our opponent, but it's to actually point out the wickedness and evil and hopefully win a brother. There is points when there's that we have to limit evil as well, and then also knowing that our opponent isn't the person in front of us, but really, we're trying to point out injustice. We're trying to point out the brokenness of this world. We're trying to transform the world, and that's what Jesus did, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I think there's a little bit of wisdom of Solomon there as well.
Yeah, I would agree.
Well, that's about all that I have. Do you guys have anything that kind of jumps out at you from last week?
We've been asking the question, what would the world look like? What would the church look like if this was the MO? Where we go that extra mile and we don't take offense. And it really is kind of difficult to imagine, This is one of those things where we can talk about it, but like, what does rubber hit the road look like for you, Peter? For you, Brian? For each of us, we have to ask that question. Where this is that where there's always that disconnect, or there's always that potential for disconnect between, we recognize the command, we recognize what it's supposed to look like in theory, but in practice, oh boy, like it can be tough. Yeah, but just talk, and I think actually perhaps the starting point with this is prayer. If you go on to the next section, pray for those who persecute you. If someone is making your life difficult, what is your first response? Are you going to pray for that person? Are you going to pray for God's work in their life? Are you going to give them to the Lord? Are you going to find something to be thankful for about them as a creature of God? I think that's where it starts. And if you can pray for the person who is making your life difficult, and that's not even persecution, you know, someone who's just annoying you, someone at work, like a boss or a coworker or a wife or a child, someone in your neighborhood, or a government official, or someone who's set a policymaker. If they're making life difficult for you, if you can pray for them when you're, because that's not even persecution, but if you can flex that and if you can pray, then you're well on your way. I think you've got the attitudes in place, and it's going to take you, when the time comes, you're going to be able to take that extra step and go that extra mile, etc. when it comes to like physical harm or being physically affected.
I'm laughing, Caleb, because I feel like you just took a page out of the sermon coming up this week. But you know, how do we step into this? And I think you're right. Like you said, you know, I would maybe rewind it one step and say, you know, we have to keep our eyes on Christ, right? This is what Christ did for us. And then this becomes an overflow. And, you know, this last week, we asked the question, like, who is my neighbor? And then the corollary of that question is, who is not my neighbor? And, you know, as much as, you know, Jesus tells us, you know, the Good Samaritan and everyone is your neighbor, I have come to know, you know, in my brokenness of heart at times, you know, I see people who are not like me, who don't think like me. I see all the things that, you know, Caleb, you talked about, like, you know, people who are making decisions for us, you know, or you know, everything from, like you said, you know, things like great resets and stuff like that. And you're like, things that threaten me as my enemy. And, you know, the first response is not to be kind to them, but to retaliate in some way. And I think you're right. Like, you know, it starts with those things. Like, are we willing to lay aside our initial response? Are we willing to lay aside some of our rights? And rather, we pray for them. We ask for a blessing upon them. One of the exercises that I hope to ask people, you know, this coming week is, you know, just think about someone who you disagree with, like you said, Caleb, someone who might be annoying to you, who isn't really, quote unquote, your neighbor in your perspective. And I want you to pray for them this week. I want you to pray for them. And then I also want you to go and make a phone call or a text or an email and just say, hey, so-and-so, I'll just say your name, Caleb, since I'm kind of looking at you. It's like, Caleb, you know what? I'm you know, I just want to bless you. I'm praying for you, and it's not some sort of weird drive-by praying. It's like, you know, I pray, Caleb, that you would actually come to your senses and that you would agree with the truth. But no, as sincere, like, you know what? Hey, I was just thinking about you, Caleb, and I was just praying that God would bless you. God would continue to guide you, give you kind of courage and wisdom on your road, you know, wherever that road might be, and be sincere. Yeah. Just to pray. And I'm thinking, you know, that's some of that step, you know, let alone should we ever face, quote unquote, an opponent that wants to slap our face. At this time, it's just like, can we even just step out in those little things of, like, you know, I want to show God's grace to other people, the people who we disagree with, the people that, you know, when I see their social media posts, I just want to kind of like go whatever, go DEFCON 5. And rather than going DEFCON 5, we not even go anything and just turn around and say, I'm going to just bring this person to God. I'm going to ask a blessing upon them. And then I'm going to actually just respond in that way. Imagine what that would start to look like.
Yeah. Crazy.
Yep. So much of it is an issue of the heart. And, you know, the Bible talks quite a bit about having a tender heart. And I think if our hearts are tender and we do have the right attitudes, then when we're in situations where somebody cuts us off in traffic or whatever it might be, then we'll also respond in a Christ-like manner, or more likely to respond in a Christ-like manner.
Yeah.
So it's a matter of the heart and being right with the Lord in our hearts and having tender hearts and praying for love for our enemies and practicing it in little things. Yeah.
Oh, what was
Any
that,
last
Peter?
comments, guys?
Oh, any last comments? I don't have any.
I don't either.
Well, then, thanks for joining us for Living the Scriptures Live. And this is Life here at McLaurin. Blessings all.
Yep.